Welcome everyone. We'll get started in a few minutes. We have a few more joining, so we'll get started momentarily. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. On behalf of EQ Office Willis Tower, I would like to welcome you to our virtual Tower Talk series, Discovering the World of Bees. EQ Office recently announced our environmental sustainability and governance program called EQ Impact, designed to build economic health in communities by regenerating urban spaces, preserving local culture, and driving humanity in our workplaces. We've partnered with Alveol this year to bring urban beekeeping and many sustainability benefits to our outdoor terrace. Bees are behind a third of all the food we eat, including fruits, vegetables, chocolate, nuts, and coffee. Today, we'll follow a bee's life from when she first emerges from her cell to her final flight. Before we get started, a few housekeeping reminders. Today, we are using Zoom meeting, so we encourage you to enable your cameras. All lines have been muted, and following the presentation, we will have a Q&A portion and invite you to use the Q&A chat feature to submit any questions you may have. Today's session will be recorded and shared following this event. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce our speaker, Travis Sherlin. Travis grew up in Tennessee, but started his beekeeping journey while he was in college near Lake Superior. He later served with the Peace Corps in West Africa, building many hives for his community and nurturing the relationships between people and bees. While there, Travis learned new methods of beekeeping and organized 2 beekeeping organizations for women. He has a degree in sustainable community development and continues to delight in the wonderful work of introducing friendly honeybees to friendly humans. Welcome, Travis.
Thank you very much. So my name is Travis Sherlin. Thank you for the warm introduction, Lauren. I am the manager of the Chicago branch for Alveol, as well as an urban beekeeper. And today I'm going to work really hard to get you to fall in love with honeybees. We kind of view honeybees as our ambassador. And so if we can get you to fall in love with honeybees, we believe that when you love something, you take care of it. And when you start to take care of honeybees, it just is an exponential understanding and growth of wanting to take care of this wonderful planet that we live on. So without further ado, I'd like to get started with the wonderful world of bees. This honeybee is a builder, a caregiver, a forager. She defies the laws of physics and pushes herself to the max every single day. And she does all this without harming any other living species. Instead, she gives life to the world around her. And here in the city, she brings life to the neighborhood. Now, there are some things that we know a lot already about honeybees. We certainly know what bees provide for us. We know that they make honey, and we know that they make beeswax too. And we know that there's some kind of a connection between bees visiting flowers and allowing fruits and vegetables to grow. But bees probably seep into your life more than you might think, whether it be in the polish used on your boots to make them waterproof, or even the product in your hair, from the honey in your cupboard to the cough drop or lip balm in your pocket right now, and even to the fruits and vegetable aisles of the grocery store. Bees and their impact are all around us. On the subject of bees seeping into our lives more than you may think, did you know that in North America alone, we have over 4,000 different types of bees? And they're all incredible. Some are bright green. Others are insanely fluffy. Some are teeny tiny. And others, not so much. Some have co-evolved to have a beautiful symbiotic relationship with one particular type of flower, living only for the duration of that flower's bloom, sometimes only a couple of weeks. Some exist in very small numbers, mostly under human radar, whereas others, like our honeybee, have become highly domesticated. Now, despite their drastically different appearances and lifespans, characteristics, what unites all of these pollinators are the extreme feats of dedication and strength that they will accomplish in their very short lifespans. Their entire lives will be devoted to laying enough eggs and collecting enough nectar and pollen to ensure that their offspring grow up healthy and hardy and ready to pollinate the next season's blooms. Without their devoted work, much of the vegetation, pardon me, much of the vegetation around us would not be able to reproduce. So though they are small, their impact is enormous. Of all of these different types of honeybees that coexist around us all the time, only one lives in a social colony of thousands, and only one transforms the liquid gold, transforms nectar into the liquid gold we call honey. If you haven't guessed it already, of course, it's the honeybee. Humans and honeybees are incredibly intertwined. And although we know some things about them, there's a lot about honeybees that's mysterious and even mesmerizing. Humans have been fascinated with honeybees for literally thousands of years. At Alveole, one of the reasons we install hives on rooftops in the city is to share this inspiring world of bees with as many people as possible. So for the time we're sharing today, we're going to take a break from everything else and just dive into the wonderful world of pollinators that coexist all around us, using the honeybee as our guide. And like Lauren said, we will have a period at the end for questions and answers. So if you have a question, write it down. You can even put it in the chat if you'd like to. All right, so let's go back to the very beginning of the relationship between honeybees and humans, back to 5000 BC, in fact. Excuse me one moment. There we go. So this is ancient Egypt. And the ancient Egyptians were some of the very first beekeepers, and they highly valued honey in their society. This was one of the hieroglyphs for beekeeper. Now, the Egyptians believed that bees came from the tears of Re, the god of the sun. And so they worshiped these bees as if they were a gift. When early explorers entered the tombs of pharaohs for the first time, they came across these huge vessels next to the pharaoh's sarcophagi, and they assumed they must be filled with jewels or precious stones. But after analyzing those vessels, we found out they were once filled with honey. Honey was so valued that pharaohs were buried with giant jugs of it, that they could take it into the afterlife with them. It was incorporated into many different aspects of their society. The ancient Egyptians took advantage of honey's antibacterial properties in the vast majority of their medicines, and beeswax was a major ingredient in many of their cosmetics. It's really kind of mind-boggling how all of these thousands of years later, we are still using hive products in much the same way. Although the techniques and the equipment has changed, the relationship between humans and bees is so strong that it stood the test of time. All right, now we're going to whiz past a few thousand years of history and flash forward to 1622, when honeybees first arrived in North America. Like many plants and animal species that have become established in North America today, like apples and white-tailed deer, trout, just to name a few, honeybees were brought to North America from Europe, specifically on Jamestown ships arriving in Virginia. If it weren't for honeybees, many of the fruit trees and other crops introduced from Europe would never have been pollinated and survived in North America. Although the way we use hive byproducts and honey has remained pretty consistent since ancient times, beekeepers' hives and hive tools have evolved throughout the years, and different cultures work with honeybees in different ways. In this photo, in the wild, honeybees tend to build their hives in sheltered, hollow spaces, kind of like tree trunks. The ancient Egyptians kept bees in these big horizontal kind of clay tubes, and you saw that in the hieroglyph we just looked at. And they would use these long sticks to kind of draw out the honeycomb and honey to harvest. When I served in the Peace Corps in West Africa, they used hives that look just like this. It's straw bundled together with some mud to kind of keep it all in this shape. And in the Middle Ages in Europe, beekeepers kept their bees in straw round baskets called skeps. And eventually more complex hives were created with actual interior structures provided for the bees, making the beekeeper's job just a little bit easier. This is what the hives we use today look like. And this is roughly what the hives on your rooftop look like. And it's inside these quiet, unassuming boxes that all this action happens. Now, you may be familiar with the sight of these kind of nests hanging off your eavesdropping or in the corners around your porch. Although this is often mistaken for a beehive, these actually belong to their distant and much more aggressive cousins. In fact, between us, honeybees are actually a little embarrassed that they were ever related to wasps, even if it was all the way back in the Cretaceous period. These two very different creatures, but they are often mistaken for each other. Seeing them right next to one another, we can see some pretty big differences in appearance. Wasps are smooth and have a bright yellow color, whereas honeybees are quite furry and are more of a golden brown. Wasps and hornets are more severe looking and angular, whereas honeybees are softer. But another invisible difference is in their diet. Honeybees are flower feeders. They're vegan, meaning their entire diet comes from nectar and pollen. Nectar is their immediate energy, it's their carbohydrates, and pollen is their protein. Wasps, on the other hand, are omnivores, meaning they eat meat, including honeybees and bee larvae sometimes. It's for this reason that wasps are so interested in human food. They can actually bite into and ingest our food. But another defining difference between the two is that wasps have a smooth stinger, and they're able to sting multiple times. Whereas a honeybee has a little barb. It's got a little hooked stinger, and it will die shortly after it stings something, because when it plunges into its aggressor, when it comes out, it can't quite get away. So when it does finally fly away, it loses part of its abdomen. And so bees are very averse to stinging. This reflects in their behavior, with wasps being more aggressive because they know they can continually sting and they can be the guardians of their hive, the fighters. Whereas a honeybee, it's really a last resort, because that stinger, it's a one-time use and they don't want to die. So they'll only use it if they really feel like their life or their hive is in dire danger. As we saw in the image before, wasps build their nests out of this papery material that they create using leaves they chew up and mix with their enzymes in their saliva. Honeybees, on the other hand, as we know, use beeswax and will build their honeycomb within the shelter of a pre-existing condition, not something that hangs outside on its own. You may have also seen other beehives or bee nests. I like to call them bee hotels. They look kind of like this. These are nests that are meant to attract wild bees like leafcutters and mason bees. Now, honeybees, leafcutters, mason bees, bumblebees, and dozens of other types of pollinators all live and work harmoniously within the city, although their life cycles are quite different from one another. Mason bees and leafcutters are called solitary bees because they don't exist in social colonies, but rather live out their lives barely interacting with another bee. They live for only roughly 6 weeks, and their entire life's mission is focused solely on laying enough eggs and collecting enough food to create several offspring. Mason bees and leafcutter bees lay their eggs in long hollow tubes in nature, often in hollow plant stems. They spend their days collecting nectar and pollen and working it into a paste called pollen butter, into which they will lay one egg. In the nesting tube, they can fit several egg chambers. So the top picture here is what you're looking at is a mason bee's nesting tube and how they breed. They go out and collect the nectar and pollen, and they form it into this little goop of yellow here, little goopy yellow ball that's just like pure nutrients for their babies. And then they put their babies, that egg, right into that food. So that baby's going to gestate and develop right into its food source and eat its food source right into becoming an adult bee. Leaf cutters and mason bees isolate their eggs using different techniques. Leaf cutters here on the bottom wrap their eggs and pollen stores in individual leaf bundles, kind of like a burrito, some might say. Whereas mason bees use mud to create a wall between each egg chamber. You can see where each bee gets their name in this photo. I quickly have to mention that watching a leafcutter bee hatch out of their bundle just might be the cutest insect moment ever, and I'm prepared to prove it. Boom. This is a leafcutter bee that's just finished its gestation process, and it's going to start clawing through that leaf bundle to enter the world. I think it's the cutest picture. So the solitary lives of most of our native pollinators are in stark contrast to the incredibly social nature of the honeybee. And really, a honeybee hive isn't too different from a city. Does anybody want to venture a guess as to how many bees can live together in one individual box? You can type it into the chat, or you can unmute yourself maybe and yell it out if you'd like. Any guesses? Fine, I'll just tell you. Even if you can't imagine it, about 50,000 bees can live in a box just like this. Just like a city, the hive starts out small in the spring and it grows bigger over time. And it's the beekeeper's job to make sure the bees have enough space to grow. So throughout the season, we add boxes to the hive as needed, turning the initial single box into a duplex, and then sometimes if it's a booming colony, into a 3-story skyscraper. Now these bees can come and go from their entrance, which runs along the bottom of the hive. And sometimes you have to watch a few moments before being able to really notice the activity. But once you do, it can be hard to look away. You start to see the flight path that all the foragers leaving the hive will follow. And this flight path changes every day depending on where the best flowers are in the city. You'll see the foragers coming back with different colors of pollen. And on a hot day, you might see bees stationed at the front, airing out the inside. Even though it might not look like it, there's a whole world going on inside that box. Kind of like a city, the thousands of bees inside a hive spend their days hard at work, carrying out a multitude of different tasks that are all individual but connected. In fact, I'm sure it's like your office. Everybody's doing their own job, but it's for a common purpose. And that's really one of the things I find most inspiring about honeybees is their capacity for teamwork. Everything they do is for the colony and for the future, for future generations. So now I'd like to introduce you to the star of the beehive. It's not Alex, who happens to be one of our co-founders, but the little friend that's hanging out on his nose, a worker bee, one of the thousands in her colony. This worker bee is just over 25 days old, which means that she's nearing the end of her life. Worker bees live for only a mere 30 to 45 days during foraging season. And in that small amount of time, they will accomplish an astonishing amount of work. Our worker bee lives with a ton of sisters, a few brothers, and one amazing hardworking mother. The worker bee on top here makes up about 90 to 95% of the colony, and they're all female. And they're given their name for a reason. They carry out the vast majority of the work in the hive. The middle photo is a picture of a drone, and the males are what we call drones. They make up a tiny part of the colony, 3 to 5%, and have a very small task list. Unlike their sisters, who we'll talk more about soon, drones don't have stingers. They're not able to forage for food. They can't do much to help with the construction of the hive. They really play into that lazy male stereotype. They just can't do a lot for the colony. But their time to shine comes once in a blue moon when a neighboring hive produces a new queen who needs to be fertilized. And that brings us to the queen, the bee on the bottom here. She is the one and only inside the colony. The queen bee is mother to all of the tens of thousands of bees within her hive. And while all of her children, the worker bees and the drones, live for only a month, the queen will live for up to 3 years. She's nearly twice as long as the worker bees, and she works extremely hard. She spends her days walking throughout the hive looking for clean cells in which to lay her eggs, and she can lay up to 2,000 eggs per day. This is no dainty hands-off queen we're talking about here. Although she does have an entourage of bees that just follow her around, feeding her, looking after her. Since the workers have such a short lifespan, the queen needs to ensure that the population is constantly regenerating, which is why she's constantly laying. The worker bees don't even want her to focus on eating or grooming. They're like, we'll take care of that. You just get busy laying eggs. It's amazing. She works so hard. Sometimes queens have amazing colors. They can be completely golden or completely black. And sometimes we come across these tiger queens that have these amazing defined stripes of black and gold. Even though the workers and drones are all laid by the same queen, there's an impressive genetic diversity inside of a colony because that queen at the beginning of her life was fertilized by an average of a dozen different drones from neighboring hives at the beginning of her life. And this is, I think, one of the most brilliant things about a colony is the way that these bees reproduce, because while there is one mother, there could be a dozen different fathers. So the bees inside the hive do have a pretty impressive spread of genetic diversity. And as we know, genetic diversity in evolutionary terms equals resilience. For example, if there was a disease that were to plague the bees, perhaps there was a genetic strain among that hive that was able to resist it. And so in that way, they protect themselves and are able to continue. They're really, really smart little creatures. Okay, back to our worker bee. Before she was fully grown, she looked like this. Like all of her sisters, it took her 21 days to develop from an egg into a fully developed bee and emerge out of her cell, ready to get to work. Bees construct their honeycomb just big enough to fit one fully grown bee. When it's laid, an egg stands upright at the bottom of the cell, and it looks like a tiny grain of rice. With help from her older sisters, who were feeding her all along the way, our worker bee slowly developed from an egg into a larva. And on the 10th day for this gestation period, her cell was capped over with a thin layer of wax so she could be as warm and undisturbed as possible for the last days of her development as a pupa. Finally, after 21 days, our worker bee was ready to emerge and clawed away at the top of her cell until she could finally crawl out. We call this a bee birthday. After looking around, getting her bearings, maybe getting trampled on a little bit, our worker bee instinctively turned back around, stuck her head into her cell, and diligently cleaned it out, making it ready to receive the next egg. Like all of her sisters, she got to work right away. I'd like to show you now an amazing video produced by National Geographic with these special cameras. As you can see in this photo, some of those cells are open. You can see into them, and some of them have caps on them. This video is so amazing because that second half of their lives gestating inside that cell, the first half we can see, but the second half is capped over. We don't really get to see that look, but National Geographic used special cameras to get this video. It's just about a minute long, and it's really, for a beekeeper, it's something special to see, kind of a look behind the curtain. And for a non-beekeeper, you would almost never get a chance to see this. So I'm really excited to show it with you, share it with you. Here we go.
Here is a bee egg as it hatches into a larva. Those newly hatched larvae swim around their cells, feeding on a liquid food that nurse bees secrete for them. Then their head and their legs start to differentiate as they transform into pupae. Here's that same pupation process seen from above with pheromones running around in the cells. Next, the tissue reorganizes in their body and the pigment slowly develops in their eyes. In the last step, their skin shrivels up and they sprout hair.
Awesome. Oh, sorry. Sorry about that. So I think that's the coolest video. It's pretty amazing how they gestate inside those cells. Over the course of the next 25 days, our worker bee is going to live out an amazing life, mastering a plethora of different tasks, all to do her part for the colony. She's going to use every talent and tool her body has to offer to contribute to the complex, zero-waste social society of her hive. And she'll do it all without even thinking twice, and likely without fully grasping the wider impacts her work is going to have on the world around her. And to think that all the while her small body will be fueled by only two things: nectar and pollen. A question that I am asked often as a beekeeper is, how do the bees decide who does what job inside the colony? And the answer is pretty simple. It's that each worker bee will do pretty much every job there is inside the colony, whether it be cleaning the hive, tending to food storage or larvae, or collecting nectar and pollen. Unlike we as humans who tend to specialize in our jobs, worker bees transition into different roles as they age and depending on what the colony needs. In fact, their body develops so that at certain times their body may finally be ready to do this job, and then it keeps developing until it has the tools to do this next job. So they continue to transition through all these roles. Something that might surprise you about our worker bee is that for the first 2 weeks of her life, she was not able to fly. Worker bees actually spend the first half of their lives indoors, doing the many tasks required to keep the hive running. She'll be able to fly and become a forager, but only after her body is ready. So after cleaning out her own cell, our worker bee is then going to keep it up, working as a housekeeper for the next few days, keeping the hive clean. She performs tasks like cleaning out moldy pollen from cells or carrying out a bit of grass to the hive entrance. Slowly and naturally, our worker bee transitioned into the role of a nurse bee, where she looked after and helped to feed the developing larvae, otherwise known as the brood. Brood is what we call any bee in the gestation period. In the days following, she might work as a guardian bee close to the entrance of the hive, a honey producer transforming the nectar her older sisters harvested from flowers into honey. In these early days, our worker bee might have even had a quick stint as one of the select few in the queen's entourage. But around the 12th day of her life, our worker bee became an architect. She starts to get a funny feeling in her abdomen, and before she knows it, she'll start producing beeswax. Similar to our sweat glands, worker bees have 8 wax glands under their abdomen that excrete beeswax. But these glands only kick into action for roughly 5 days of a worker's life, and it takes a lot of honey to produce beeswax, roughly 8 pounds of honey to make 1 pound of beeswax. So it's a really labor and material intense task that they have to do inside the hive to build their home. While working as an architect, our bee learned the skill of building honeycomb. She learned that hexagons are the most space and material efficient shape to exist. And she worked with her sisters to soften the clay with enzymes in her mouth and then mold it into the honeycomb structure, much like we would work with clay or Play-Doh. In between her different roles, our worker bee also helped to heat and ventilate the hive, working intermittently as a ventilator bee. Now, ventilator bees are responsible for keeping the hive at a consistent 95 degrees, as well as for keeping the air circulation even. When ventilators are working, their wings beat so fast, the human eye is often unable to see them. These ventilator bees will station themselves at strategic points throughout the box, drawing in air from outside and then circulating it throughout the colony. On cold days, they'll work by vibrating their muscles to create heat. And on cold days, they'll incorporate water from outside the hive into their circulation as a cooling air conditioning effect. And I actually just read some research that suggested that bees might actually drink a bit of water and spit it into their honeybee sisters' faces on the hottest of days to cool them down, which I like to imagine. It's just a fun scene to picture inside a hive. And then eventually, after what might have felt like an eternity, our worker bee was pulled aside by one of her sisters and told that it was time for her to learn the Waggle Dance, the first step to becoming a forager. And the Waggle Dance, by the way, is its real official name, believe it or not. The Waggle Dance is how foragers communicate with each other where to find the best sources of food. And it all has to do with the sun. For example, if our worker bee were to leave this roof and find a gorgeous linden tree blooming down Grand Avenue, she'll come back to the hive and waggle a certain way to communicate to her sisters to leave the hive, find the sun, and fly, a mile down the street in that direction, or a mile east to find that tree. So they're talking to each other and giving each other maps to find the best flowers, which I think is really great. And I'm going to show you another quick video which demonstrates this Waggle Dance. And this is equally as amazing, if not even more so than the first video I showed. So please enjoy. One second, I'm sorry. Here we go. Thanks for your patience. All right.
The duration of her waggle indicates the distance to the nectar source. The longer the waggle, the further the flower. And the angle at which she dances across the comb tells them the direction to the flower in relation to the sun. Her instructions are remarkably accurate and can pinpoint the location of a nectar source over 6 kilometers away. Some of her fellow workers set off immediately to find it.
I think that's just the most amazing video. It's, when you think about what the bees are doing on their level, it would be like if I were to come into your house and say, hey, find the sun, go 1.5 miles in that direction, and you're going to find some great food. Like even we would have an enormous amount of trouble locating that flower, but the bees do it with such precision. They can communicate a flower source up to 3 miles away to their sisters, and their sisters will successfully find that flower source. Pretty remarkable. All right, so with the Waggle Dance down, our worker bee was ready to head out into the flower boxes and flowering tree-lined streets of the city. While working as a forager, our worker bee was finally able to take advantage of her impressive foraging tools. She's going to use her super long straw-shaped tongue to slurp up all the nectar the flowers around her have to offer. Another surprising fact about worker bees is that they have 2 stomachs. One is for eating and digesting their food, and one is for transporting nectar back to the hive, which is not so creatively named by beekeepers, the honey stomach. Now, the honey stomach has enzymes in it that will start to thicken that nectar into honey. And when our worker bee is visiting flowers, she'll be filling up her honey stomach with as much nectar as she can fit. And she'll be loading up her pollen baskets with as much pollen as she can pack in. She has these tiny, stiff hairs that line the back of her legs, which actually get charged with static electricity as she flies through the air, and it helps to attract that fluffy pollen as she lands on the flower. So when her honey stomach is completely filled with nectar and her pollen baskets are completely stuffed with pollen, this worker bee, our worker bee, can weigh up to twice her body weight. And while humans struggle to lift even our own body weight for just a few seconds, our worker bee will pull off the amazing feat of flying up to 3 miles back to her hive with twice her body weight many times a day. This is a great shot of her pollen pockets. These are those little yellow globs under her belly, and those pockets are kind of invisible until they're stuffed with pollen. And then you go, oh, wow, they've got some really good pockets there. And I always like to see them because the color of the pollen is dependent on the flower. Different flowers give different colored pollens. So as a beekeeper, when I open a beehive, I get to see sometimes just a rainbow of different pollens coming back, and it's just stunning. It's really beautiful. Okay, so one thing that our worker bee hadn't been prepared for, her first day in the flowers of her neighborhood, were all of the other pollinators that she would come across. One of the most beautiful moments of her life was slurping up the last of the nectar a flower had to offer, only to look up and see a gorgeous painted lady butterfly. Our worker bee looked up at the size of the butterfly's wings and wondered what it would feel like to fly with such a great wingspan and to drink nectar with such a long tongue. Every day as a forager, our worker bee crossed paths with bumblebees and leafcutters and hummingbirds as they all benefited from the city's bountiful blooms. Our worker bee is never going to forget her first day coming back to the hive, her honey stomach loaded with nectar from clover flowers she found in Grant Park, and her legs packed with pollen from linden trees on Michigan Ave. She'll always remember the pride she felt returning to the hive after her first nectar run. She landed at the entrance, took a second to appreciate the moment, one she had thought about for so long, only to be speedily brushed by one of her sisters that was eager to drop off her harvest and head back out. And that was okay. Our worker bee was not expecting any fanfare. What brought her joy was knowing that she was helping her colony, doing her part and contributing not only to the health of her current sisters, but of generations to come. But little did she know that by visiting the flowers of the neighborhood, she was also ensuring the future generations of the plant life around her and on which so many creatures rely. You see, it's pollinators like our worker bee that allow the plants we rely on for survival to reproduce. Without pollinators visiting and fertilizing flowers, 2/3 of the food we eat would disappear, and plant life would diminish to a catastrophic level. In urban areas, it's thanks to our pollinators that the flowering trees and urban gardens of the city flourish the way that they do. And in agricultural areas, it's pollinators, in large part, the honeybee, who have the monumental and thankless task of pollinating the billions of flowers it takes to grow the fruits and vegetables and nuts that we eat, most of which are grown using pesticides. As a culture here in North America, we've become very disconnected from how our food is produced, often not being able to picture all the steps involved in growing and processing the food we eat that we purchase then at the grocery store. As a result, honeybees often become this invisible collateral damage in the production of fruits and vegetables that are produced for us to eat. When pollinators visit flowers that have been sprayed with these pesticides, they ingest that toxic chemical that's meant to kill other pests. And this results in millions of valuable pollinators dying year after year after year. One of the biggest impacts you can have when it comes to protecting pollinators is actually in the grocery store. When you vote with your dollar towards organic produce, you're also voting for a kind of agriculture that protects our pollinators and strays away from using toxic chemicals. I do like to also acknowledge that voting with your dollar is a bit of a classist answer to this problem because not everybody can afford organic produce all the time. So there are other things you can do as well, like planting local wildflowers for our bees to feed on, which anybody can do. And likewise, the bee hotels that I mentioned and showed in the previous slide, those are available online for very cheap, or you can make them. A lot of people have DIY bee motels, which allows a space for our local bees, our native bees, to make home and to survive year after year. Okay, so to bring it back to our bee, she is now 25 days old, and she's well into her journey as a forager. It could be argued that our worker bee knows this neighborhood better than any of us. She knows every square inch of the radius around her hive. She knows every type of tree, every type of flower, the water sources and how to find them. She even knows some things that we may not. Like 3 buildings down the road, there's actually a thriving rooftop garden with the most delicious strawberry flowers. Maybe around the corner in an inner courtyard we can't see is where the best lavender in the city grows. That kind of ugly vacant lot a few blocks from here is not ugly at all for our worker bee, but to her, it's a flowering paradise of weeds. It's breakfast, lunch, and dinner all season. She's got a few days left ahead of her, and those days will be spent helping to bulk up the hive's honey production before the end of the season. Our worker bee, just like all of her sisters, is literally going to forage and fly until she cannot anymore. Most likely she'll pass largely unnoticed on her last nectar run to or from the hive. There won't be any fanfare. The impacts of her life find itself in the collective accomplishments of her colony and in the fruits of the labor of her pollination all around the city. Our worker bee is just one of over hundreds of thousands of bees that have lived and died building her colony and pollinating her surroundings. And her colony is just one of the many that exist around the city. Each hive and the combination of flowers that surround it is unique. And every time we open up one of these quiet, unassuming boxes, we are opening a self-sufficient, fascinating world. And we're so happy to be able to share this experience with you, because when you start to see a city, and indeed the world through the eyes of a honeybee, you start to see it a bit differently. And you realize it's not actually the concrete jungle that it's chalked up to be. In fact, the city is an incredibly rich environment full of potential. Thank you so much. So I'd love to open it up for questions now.
Yes, thanks, Travis. That was
Absolutely.
really fascinating information that you shared with us today. And I can speak for myself that I learned a lot about the honeybees. So we will start a Q&A session now. So if you have any questions, please feel free to put those in the chat or unmute yourself and ask them. We have a couple of questions that were pre-submitted, so we'll go through those first. How many beehives are going to be installed on the roof deck at Willis Tower, and when will they be installed?
Yeah, so we are so excited. We will be bringing 3 hives to Willis Tower and installing them on June 7th. That's when they'll make their debut to the world.
We're so excited for that day. Are honeybees interested in humans, and are they likely to sting?
That's a good question and an important one. It's pretty much the first question we get asked when we're bringing bees to workplaces. It's like, isn't this kind of dangerous? And the answer is really no. Honeybees, like I mentioned earlier, are vegans. They're not going to be flying around you. In fact, they won't even be specifically around your building. That's where their home is. But as soon as they are awake for the day, those foragers are going to be flying all over the city to find the best blooms. And they really have no interest in humans. In fact, when I come to work on hives, I come in a shorts and t-shirt. We use a specific kind of bee. It's the Italian species called Apis mellifera lucifica. They're bred specifically for their docility and their cold hardiness. So it's like the right bee for Chicago. But yeah, they really think that humans are mostly trees. In fact, if you stood still and a bee flies over near you, which they do from time to time because humans smell nice occasionally, they're usually trying to just smell what you smell like. Maybe you smell like a flower or a tree. They might land on you. They're not going to sting you. They'll likely fly away. However, when the bee does come near you, the instinct, and it's kind of natural, is to swat, because it's a little scary. I understand that. However, when you do that kind of swatting, jumping movements, then you start to look like a bear or an enemy, something that actually would try to get into the hive and kill the bee or take their honey. So that's when you're more likely to get stung. It's counterintuitive, but if you ever are near a bee, you want to just be really calm and still. You can slowly walk away if you're ever uncomfortable. But they really have no interest in humans at all.
Thanks. How long do queen bees typically live?
It's a great question. Queen bees are amazing. They have a special diet as they're gestating, which is really what allows them to grow into this queen body. And queen bees can live up to 3 years. We had one in Montreal that lived about 5 years, and we were really impressed with her. And some that only live about a season. Maybe they have different issues. It's a pretty bee eat bee world inside the hive. If the queen isn't doing a good job or laying enough eggs, maybe she broke a leg or something and she's just not performing like she should, the worker bees will decide to replace her. They are merciless, but it's all for the good of the hive in the long run. Joshua
asked, is there only one queen bee or is there multiple?
It's a good question. Every hive, so a hive is what we call not just one box, but anything that grows vertically. So if we add another box or another box, that's still considered one beehive. And so in one hive, there will only be one queen ever. For example, if, like I was just talking about, if there were another bee that were to be born inside that hive, they would battle until the death, because that queen is like, whoa, this is my space. And the other queen's like, I'm trying to take over. They would literally battle for dominance because they can't get two messages. The worker bees need one message from one leader. And so only one queen per hive.
Thank you. Lisa asked, what do they do in the winter when there are less flowers and trees?
Such a good question. So honeybees are visiting flowers all day long. They're going to visit millions, literally millions of flowers over the course of the season. And the reason they're doing this is they're taking little tiny sips of nectar. I don't know if you've ever, when I was a kid, I used to find honeysuckle flowers, and you can pull the thing through and you get a little bit of honey at the end. I used to taste that little bit of nectar, and it was just a fun thing to do as a kid. Bees are doing this every day, taking just tiny bits of nectar, bringing it back to the hive, and they're actually going to evaporate the water out of that nectar. So the nectar touches first their stomach to get those good gut enzymes, and then they actually regurgitate the nectar into their hive, and they kind of flap their wings above that nectar cell. And what happens is it draws the water out until it's thick enough. It's about 17% water concentration. When they've got it down to that level, that nectar will never spoil. That's when we call it honey. And they're doing this so that when the winter comes and there are no flowers to easily find nectar from, they stay inside their hive. They cuddle up with all their sisters, kind of making a ball around the queen to stay warm. And they just sip on the nectar that they've been making all year. It's a pretty sweet life for the bees in the winter, for sure.
Well-deserved rest.
Indeed.
How does the drone know where the queen is that needs his services?
That's another great question. And there's still some research going on. I've been reading kind of conflicting research, which is tricky, but that's what you get in the world of science and research. But in any case, there are pheromones that the queen and the drones apparently can pick up from like a mile away. That's like an alarm that says we're ready to mate. So they'll actually somehow create this rendezvous, and they'll meet the queen from one hive, the drones from others. They'll find this place, some other place in the city, and they have a good time. And what's crazy is actually that those drones will die right after they mate. That's their whole life. Their whole life purpose is to mate that queen. They die, and she goes back to start a new colony or to start laying eggs.
Very interesting. Is it hard on the bees being so high up?
It's a great question. Bees generally, when they're on ground level, what they do is they are always going to fly out of the hive a few feet, and they launch up. And they do that because they want to get an aerial view of their surroundings, of flowers in their area, of path they need to take to get to that flower source maybe that they were made aware of by their other sisters. We try to keep our bees at a reasonable level. 20 stories is no problem for bees. It seems like a lot for us, but when you consider that bees are flying miles and miles and miles each day to get their flowers, it's just a bit of a different direction they're flying, down or up instead of across to get to their flowers. So the only time when it does become a bit of an issue is when the winds are crazy, but we try to find places that are really, really good for our hives so they're not too windy. Even then, the bees have no problem getting back into their hives. They're incredibly strong little creatures.
It can be very windy. I missed the portion on the bee motels. Can you share a brief recap on what they are?
Yeah, so some of our native native bee species use these little, I actually have a perfect example, a straw from my cup. They use these perfect little like straws generally it's a hollowed out plant stem that they'll find in nature. And whereas a honeybee makes a honeycomb and lays their eggs in this honeycomb, a mason bee will use these bee hotels they'll put an egg here with some pollen butter and then a wall, and then an egg here with some pollen butter and then a wall. And they're just making little chambers all the way up through the straw to lay their their babies, and their babies gestate, I think it's for like 8 months. It's much longer than a honeybee. So they're gestating like the whole year. And then when they're born, they only have a few weeks to collect that nectar and pollen, mate, and start making some more for the next year. It's a pretty amazing schedule that they're on. But those bee motels, you can buy them at Lowe's, Home Depot, Ace, any of those kind of like hardware places. You can also find like DIY kits or how-tos online. And it's a really great way to do something sustainable. You can put it anywhere. It's never going to bother any neighbors or anything, but it does offer a habitat for our local bees who we love. So it's a great idea.
Very neat. I live near farms that use glyphosate regularly on their crops. I would like to keep bees, but wonder if my location would be bad for beekeeping. Also, would the honey they produce be contaminated with the chemical weed killer?
Oh, that's a great question. To be honest, I'm not sure about the second part. I don't know if the honey would be contaminated. I think not likely, because that chemical is going to kill the bees. It's not going to likely work its way into their honey stomachs and then back out into a hive. But it would be a concern to have a beehive near a farm where they're using pesticides. You would have a higher chance of losing those bees. What I would do is I would find a local beekeeping club. The best, I'm a professional beekeeper, and I feel like I know a lot about what I'm doing. But there's something about an 80-year-old beekeeper. You just got to go to an old timer who has seen so much with these bees. And so that's my first advice to anybody that's getting into beekeeping is find you an old timer beekeeper who knows all the tips and tricks, and he can let you know those kind of things. It would be a bit of a challenge to have your hive there, but I wouldn't say it's impossible. We'll take some more research for sure.
Thanks. Let me see here. I'm just combing through. What happens to the queen bees during the winter? I think we kind of touched on this, but
yeah, the queen bees just stay right inside the center because they're the only ones inside this colony. It could be 10,000, 50,000 bees. Only one bee in there is laying eggs, and it's the queen. And so if the queen dies, the colony is kind of doomed, right? The population is just going to dwindle and dwindle and dwindle because there's nothing to replenish the population. So in the wintertime, the bees are going to make this kind of cluster, this kind of big ball inside the hive. And the queen is generally in the middle of that bubble somewhere because they want her to stay really warm and protected as long as she makes it through the spring. Even if some of these bees out here on the outside of the circle get too cold and maybe die, as long as they protect the queen bee in the middle, she can regenerate the population in the spring. So she's got the middle spot in the bed for the winter time, and she stays really warm and cozy.
Best seat in the house. Please compare the bee vision to human eye ability. From what distance can bees spot the target that its sisters waggled about?
That's a great question. I don't know at which distance, like spatially, when they see the flower, when they notice like, oh yeah, that's the spot that the sisters were talking about. I'm not sure when that happens. However, we see flowers in a completely different way than honeybees do. I wish I had an example of a flower to show you, but what's amazing is bees, you have to use ultraviolet light to see what bees see on a flower. And it really turns any flower into, from my experience, from what I've seen, flowers under ultraviolet light, it looks like they're more of like a bullseye or a target. And it seems like there's no other explanation. Those are evolutionary changes to make this, like, literally it's a target, it's a bullseye for the bees to fly to. So that's pretty remarkable. What you're seeing when you look at flowers isn't quite what the bees see. They see different lines, different colors, maybe even different shapes sometimes. And they're all, they kind of co-evolve together. So those flowers are being brighter and brighter, more beautiful, more attractive. So the bees find them more and more and pollinate them. So it's a really cool evolutionary relationship that bees and flowers have in that way.
That's amazing. We have a couple more minutes if anyone else has any questions that they would like to submit, or feel free to unmute yourself and ask them. One question came in. You mentioned pesticides kills bees. Do weed killers have the same impact if a bee goes to a flower that has weed killer on it?
The short answer is yes. It will, yeah. If that flower's been kind of sprayed with chemicals, it's the same kind of thing as a pesticide, as a weed killer. It's all just toxic chemicals meant to kill something and leave something else alive. But generally, the honeybees they're going to slurp up the nectar, which has got that chemical sprayed onto it, and so it's not good for the bees for sure. Was there a second half of that question? I'm sorry.
No, I think you answered it well. Courtney, let us know if you have any follow-up questions. Is that it when that does happen, does it kill the bee instantly, or do they go back to the hive?
No, they generally, well, I guess I'm not sure, to be honest, how long the effect takes to kick in. But I have seen bees that have been affected. They look kind of like they're like drunk or something. They're like kind of wobbly, a little bit disoriented. Maybe they're walking in circles. It's a pretty sad thing to see.
We have time for one more. I've heard that mites are a real danger to bees. How can that be prevented?
Yeah, so in that first video I showed you, I don't know if you'll recall, but it talked about those bees that were gestating, and it said this one is a view of those bees with varroa mites on top. And in that video, those little red mites, they're called varroa, and they're a global pest for beekeepers. Every beekeeper should be treating their hives to prevent against this thing. And it's different beekeepers use different techniques on how to prevent this, but it is something that's plagued. Most hives have certain symptoms of this varroa mite. And what we do is we treat our bees twice a year, but in the spring and then after harvest, so it has no effect on the honey production at all. It is a problem, and it's something that if you're keeping bees, it's something you need to be really aware of. And we also vary our techniques so that we're using this thing to prevent varroa at this time of the year, and a different tool to prevent them in the fall, so that they're not becoming resistant to either one of our treatments. It takes a lot of forethought for sure. Bees come like kids with their own problems and illnesses and all that kind of stuff. So we do our best.
Okay. If bees die once they sting, why are we so scared of bees?
I really don't know. Some people tell me they're scared of bees, and I always am empathetic because they're tiny flying creatures with stingers. It's like, if you don't know how sweet they are, that knowledge alone could be scary. Like, oh my gosh, they could fly anywhere. They're faster than me. I can't get to them. They can sting me. I think we're scared of them because of the cartoon images that we've been shown, like a swarm cloud of bees coming to attack somebody, which doesn't ever happen. In fact, swarm bees are the most docile kinds of bees. It's when they're looking for a new home, so they're even more disinterested in humans. A bee sting is not pleasant if you've ever had it, but it's not all that bad. I'm not sure why we're so afraid of them. I guess part of the reason that I'm doing what I'm doing is to help you all overcome that fear and to enjoy them a little bit more. I think the more you learn about something, the less scary it is, whether it be other things like bees or baseball or history or wine or other cultures. So yeah, we like to share our knowledge and passion for bees.
As Melanie points out, that some people are allergic, so that may also be a fear there.
That's true as well.
But any other questions that we did not address, we can address following the presentation, but we did want to take some time to announce the queen bee names as voted on by tenants. So Travis, if you would be so kind to hit the next slide. The top voted queen bee names were some historical women, so including Harriet Busman, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and Susan B. Anthony. So those bee names will be placed on each of our hives once they're installed in June. And we welcome, we're looking forward to installing those hives and welcoming our queen bees, and invite you to stop by the outdoor terrace to see the custom design and painted hives by our Marwin alumni. Thank you so much for attending today's Tower Talk. Keep an eye out for our post-event communication. And for the latest building news and updates, follow us on social media at Willis Tower Chicago. Subscribe to the tenant exclusive My Willis Tower app, and be sure to subscribe to our building newsletter, the 110. Thank you, Travis, again so much, and we hope you all enjoy the rest of your afternoon.
Thanks, Lauren. It was a pleasure speaking with you all today. Look for us around the building this year, and we look forward to seeing you at our next alveole workshop.
Thank you.
Thank you. Can you give the bee names again, the hive names?
Oh, sure. Travis, would you mind flipping back? Thank you.